Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. So today it's Tunza Games with CCG Trust and two of the projects they support. So Francesca and Irene from Kenya Wildlife Trust and Wild Survivors. So we get a really good chance to hear about what CCG Trust do overall, and then also particularly Wild Survivors and Kenya Wildlife Trust, some of their key work. So should be really interesting to see how the donations from the game actually help support conservation in the field. So we're going to start. Stuart from CCG Trust will give us an overview of the CCG Trust Investors in Wildlife. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Richard. Pleasure to be here today. So the CCG Trust, which operates under the slogan Investors in Wildlife, is a private charitable trust, which we set up, 13 years ago, focused on conservation work in Africa. I'm the founding trustee, and I'm joined by two other volunteer trustees, and Katie, who I'll introduce in a second, who also is a volunteer and does great work for the trust. The concept is that we are funded by a network of private investors that we've built up in our business, which we run alongside. And the aim is to support entrepreneurial conservationists working in the field. In other words, enabling innovation in African conservation. And I should add that we are a registered British charity, which was set up in 2007. Thank you. Our overall mission, therefore, is to connect. I'll start again. Our overall mission is to connect private donors with conservationists who manage high-impact fieldwork projects. And Katie, my colleague, will talk a little bit more about some of the criteria we use to select projects. Our overall aim is to help secure a future for threatened species and natural habitats in Africa. So I'd like to ask my colleague, Katie Hunter, to say a few words about the project portfolio and how we select projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Struan. So in order to achieve our aim, we support a number of sort of carefully selected projects, and each of these projects follows a certain criteria that we've set out. So for example, most of these projects are founder managed, they conduct direct field work, they employ significant numbers of local people, and they work on long-term sustainable solutions. Alongside this, we use a measured and evidence-based approach to tackle the big issues. So we follow a process of detailed screening and end-of-year impact measurements to ensure that we have a disproportionate positive impact per donation. And with this criteria, we're able to bring tangible benefits for both nature and the local community. So these are our projects, as you can see, past and present, and they tackle a range of issues, including sort of anti-poaching measures, conservation education, protecting at-risk species, and reducing human-wildlife conflict. So as you can see, they're distributed sort of mostly throughout East Africa, but new for this year is our project in Sierra Leone, which is the Takugama Chimpanzee Sanctuary. So we've just started supporting them, and they help injured and orphaned chimpanzees, as well as they've been setting up some community conservation work to protect chimpanzees that are in the wild. So that's us, the CCG Trust in a nutshell. If you'd like to get in touch and find out more, we've got contact details at the bottom of the slide.
Great, thanks very much, Katie and Stuart. That was really interesting. So I'll give a quick overview of Tunza Games now, and then introduce Irene and Francesca. So Tunza Games is about creating great games for a great cause and trying to make it as fun and easy as possible for people to save wildlife. So our first game, Conservation Crisis, puts players in charge of a wildlife reserve, and they have to rescue an endangered species, all based on the real life challenges of conservation. And that's what we want to hear about today, is actually what are those real life challenges. So if I could start by introducing Francesca from Wild Survivors. And actually, Francesca, maybe it's easier if you just give a quick overview of what you and your organisation do.
Great, absolutely. Thanks so much, Richard and CCG Trust. Lovely to join the webinar today. So my name is Francesca Mahoney. I'm the founder and director of Wild Survivors. We're a small UK registered charity with projects based mainly in Tanzania. And the focus of our work is mitigating human-elephant conflict. So using sustainable initiatives that place community welfare at the heart of wildlife conservation. And we do this mainly using very natural techniques such as beehive fences to prevent elephants from entering farms, establishing beekeeping enterprises, and also focusing on forest and habitat protection, including one of the last remaining wildlife corridors that connects ecosystems in northern Tanzania. And that's all completely community managed to protect the wildlife and the habitat that they depend on.
Great, thanks very much, Francesca. And then Irene from Kenya Wildlife Trust. Again, if you just give an overview of the work you do in your organisation.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Richard and CCG Trust, for having me on the webinar today. So as you've mentioned, I work for the Kenya Wildlife Trust as the director, and KWT was formed in 2007, and it was formed by players in the tourism industry. So we operate against 3 pillars, so predators, people, and partnerships. And our value proposition is that we're driven by science, but really focused on people. So we believe that for wildlife to thrive, the communities who coexist with them need to be able to have improved access to healthcare and education and enhanced livelihood opportunities so that they can enjoy these direct and tangible benefits. So in order to do this, we form strategic partnerships with like-minded organizations and individuals who we work with in order to achieve our objectives. And so, since 2007, we've been supporting predator conservation programs across Kenya, but in 2013, we set up our own program in the Mara, so the Mara Predator Conservation Program, which CCG has been supporting for the past couple of years. And one of the key things that we do, in addition to carrying out research and providing the evidence based on the population trends and threats facing predators in this important ecosystem, is working alongside communities to try and mitigate any impacts arising from conflict. So we have campaigns around poisoning, which is one of the key ways that conflict is retaliated against by the community. But we also have an education program that targets young children, and we do this by running wildlife clubs. So over the webinar, I'll talk more about these programs that we run in the Mara. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Brilliant, thanks Irene. So that's a great start. So I've got just 6 questions to run through to sort of draw out some of the work that you both do, so we can find out a bit more about that. So the first question really goes to, I think, the heart of conservation that many people from outside or when first coming in don't perhaps see as that important, but community conservation that's so key to successful conservation. So yeah, if you could just tell us more about the sort of livelihoods and human-wildlife conflict mitigation work that you do, I think that'd be really interesting to start. So Irene, you're on screen if you want to go first.
All right, so in the Mara, we, as I've mentioned, we strongly believe in having evidence-based solutions. So we have a community team, so 2 community members who work with us, who spend a lot of their time engaging communities and talking to them on how to solve these issues, because, as I mentioned earlier, it's important for communities to feel that they are part of conservation, since they're the ones who live with the wildlife that we're trying to conserve. So our community team often, spend time with community members. We have a new program called Lion Ambassadors, who are community members, but they are sort of the first call and the first step when conflict cases happen. So the communities reach out to them and they rush to the scene and are able to try and talk to the community members who are affected by the conflicts, be it hyenas or lions getting into, the livestock enclosures and killing the livestock and just trying to, convince them not to retaliate. And in the Mara, one of the key challenges we have is poisoning. So a lot of times when there is a conflict incident, there is poisoning that is laced on carcasses, and these are put out for the predators to come and eat, and then they die. But what we found is that the knock-on effect is this spread to water bodies, and you have other animals and birds getting affected. So we work with other organizations like Nature Kenya, who are part of the BirdLife Consortium, to tackle some of these issues, and using community methods and activities to reach out. So we've work with a local drama group who create messages in the local Ma language about the dangers of poisoning, and this is spread to communities during market days. And we also more proactively train first responders, so that's rangers and conservancy managers, on how to decontaminate poisoning sites when these are found. So a lot of our work revolves around sitting down with the communities and coming up with practical ways to try and mitigate any issues around human-wildlife conflict.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. And actually, was it Lion Ambassadors? The first?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's really, I made a note of that. Interesting project. And are you seeing the benefits of that coming out, that people are now starting to get a much more positive view of the wildlife and an understanding of the need not to retaliate against predators?
Yes, I think for me, the positive and immediate impact is the fact that they are able to pick up the phone and call the Lion Ambassador, who will then call our community manager. And with that, the community manager is able to call the Kenya Wildlife Services and Conservancy Rangers to really address the question. So a really good example is, today morning, we got a WhatsApp message from the Mara team that last night suspected hyenas got into Boma, Manyata, which is sort of their traditional homestead, and killed 15 sheep. And the unfortunate thing is this community member only had these 15 sheep. And, so now it's going to be a process of the ambassador and our community team talking to him about, this is really unfortunate, but please don't go out to kill the wildlife, and helping them fill in the compensation forms and submitting this to KWS. So on a day-to-day basis, this is what we're seeing, happening. Another instance is when there was a lion that was snared a couple of months ago, and the community immediately called our team to go out and then bring KWS to try and remove the snare from the lion. So I think having that continuous engagement with the people living with the wildlife and making sure that they feel that they're part of the process has really helped. But also, being very practical about it. So, for today's incident, it's looking at the enclosure that the sheep were in, and if it's a weak enclosure, how do we then work with the community to reinforce that enclosure to ensure that we don't have any more incidents. And one of the other things we do is also try and build predator-proof bombers with communities. So working with a local industry in Nairobi who recycle waste plastic and turn this into poles. And we use those poles to build up, predator-proof bombers. I'll share a few pictures at the end just to show how these look like. And it's, it sort of ticks two boxes. We prevent conflict, but we are also not destroying the environment, which is one of the things that, ultimately we are trying to do, making sure that the landscape is kept as pristine as possible.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, that's really interesting as well to see both the scientific angle of improving those bomas as well as also the engagement with the community as well, and how that all interacts. So that's brilliant. So Francesca, maybe the sort of view, we've seen the view from the predator angle and the risk associated with that. So then elephants can be, I suppose, as deadly as predators as well. So maybe you can give an insight into the community work you do.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And so fascinating to hear from Irene about the methods that KWS use. We're quite a small organisation. We were founded in 2016. So at the beginning of all of this, I set out to build really long-term relationships with the communities. And when learning more about this largely underfunded area of human-elephant conflict, there's a lot of funding that does go into anti-poaching activities, which are really critical. But underneath it all is this bubbling pot of conflict, which often overflows and creates really long-term impacts on the community and the safety of the environment as well. So when we learned about the beehive fence method and met with Dr. Lucy King from Save the Elephants in Kenya, and I went to training and learned how the technique works, we set out to replicate this in northern Tanzania, which is an area where you've got the northern circuit, the northern tourism circuit of Tarangire National Park, Lake Bunyara, Ngorongoro Crater, Serengeti. So there's a lot of funding that goes into some of the safari lodges and the tourism aspect. And so off the back of that, there's a huge amount of development at the same time. So there has been a bit of, or quite a fair bit of habitat fragmentation, and communities at the same time are trying to sustain their lives. They're trying to feed their families, they're trying to get their kids to school. And as a result, we saw that there wasn't a whole lot of new education trickling down to villages about agriculture techniques and making things more efficient with farming. So as a result, there was just further encroachment as farms grew bigger and bigger in an attempt to have higher yields. At the same time, of course, you've got these areas of critical habitat which elephants depend on, and also migration routes and migration areas like corridors that elephants use as connectivity. And all of that was being bisected by villages and farms. So as a result, there was a real heightened conflict. Elephants, they've obviously got this high risk, high reward built into their brains, where they will take big risks to try and get the most nutritional food that they can, and that's often crops. Like maize, for example. So they do tend to raid farms. They often do this at night under the cover of darkness. They've learned to adapt their behavior because of poaching. So community members are staying up all night, every night. They're exhausted and they try and defend their farms. And this often leads to obviously worse effects with conflicts. Irene mentioned poisoning, which is something that we've seen in Tanzania as well in the past. Where pumpkins and watermelons are injected with pesticides and left in the trail of where they know elephants are going to visit. And of course, that doesn't just kill off in a horrible way the elephants and their families, but then it has that onwards impact of affecting predators, vultures. So it's hugely damaging. Thankfully, in the north, things have evolved quite a bit. The communities that we work in are being really proactive, and they want to learn more about how to live alongside wildlife. And really, that's something that we believe strongly in, is that the health and protection of ecosystems is directly linked to the people living alongside them and within them. So by establishing long-term relationships, learning about the wider context of how people survive and what they need to survive and improve and develop livelihoods, we focus on community managed solutions to conflict with elephants. And using bees and beekeeping and beehives, we can create this peaceful, natural coexistence model that is easy to manage, and it has a sort of win-win solution, really, because of the income that can be generated from the honey and the wax. But primarily, community members are taught, and they take part in workshops in beekeeping and learn that keeping the bees in the hives is the most important part, because that's what helps to keep the elephants out. And this also then plays into the issue of habitat protection, and the beehive fences almost act as a bit of a boundary to say, look, this is going to help benefit livelihoods, this is going to create new livelihoods as well in beekeeping. Let's look at alternative farming techniques so we don't need to keep encroaching beyond these boundaries into forests and the wildlife corridors as well. So really it's about building self-reliance from the communities, resilience within that community, and also looking at other basic health needs that really we all take for granted a lot of the time, that communities struggle to reach: medical care, education, And often that means traveling across areas of habitat that's where elephants are residing. So that's something else that we look at, ensuring that that doesn't increase conflict as well.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. That's really interesting. And actually, an interesting piece sort of from both of those things, I think, is the integration of education into those community programs as well. So it's not just about providing livelihoods or defences, actually making sure that people understand how and why they work as well, which I think leads quite nicely into the next question, which is just if you can talk a bit more about the education programs that you can provide to people on the ground. So Francesca, if you start with that one.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's a good segue into education, which absolutely is the foundation to conservation and the protection of habitat. Community members and villages, local people, they actually have vast amounts of knowledge about their own environment. And I think often NGOs are too quick to come in and say, right, we need to establish these workshops, this training, and actually talking and listening to local people. I've learned a huge amount from the communities that we work with, and it's really fascinating to know their knowledge about the trees, about the local environment, the climate, how it's changed. So what we do is we bring in specific programs that will help benefit the solution, the coexistence solution. So we do beekeepers training. We began this by bringing in beekeeping experts from elsewhere in Tanzania that were linked to the Sokoine University. This was something that the CCG Trust helped to fund as well. And we provided this training not just to farmers who were on the front line of conflict with elephants at the top, because we're actually bordering the Ngorongoro crater. So it's quite unpredictable terrain and quite challenging. But we have training that's held in the village and at the top there, because it means that anyone can attend. And we saw a huge influx of people from within the centre of the village as well, that perhaps weren't at the direct interface of conflict with elephants, but simply just were so interested to learn a new skill and the opportunity to develop an additional livelihood to farming, which also benefits the farming and the protection of the natural habitat around them. So we've established this now with, since those training workshops, we now have village members who are skilled in beekeeping. As of course it's a really traditional and livelihood in many parts of Africa. So you'll always find beekeepers in villages around where we work, in Tanzania and Kenya as well. So we employ local people from the communities who are skilled in beekeeping to continue helping their fellow community members develop their skills in beekeeping, whether it's harvesting, building more hives, learning about bee welfare, and how best to care for their bees as well. And also we then develop that onto enterprise training, how to market products, how to package, how to manage funds as well, and distribute that carefully into community funds as well. And something else that we're developing at the moment is training in permaculture, which again will really help to benefit not only the land that communities own, but the habitat that surrounds them as well. Which will help with things like crop diversification, better land use, the soil health as well. And this all feeds into the overall model of coexistence and benefiting from the natural environment, not just seeing it as something for tourists to come in and enjoy, but actually communities to have to really invest in it and to feel the benefits from that in return. So permaculture, and also another training and education program that we're bringing in is on alternative fuel sources. So we're looking at establishing some programs in biofuel. And this came about really because of the extent of tree felling that occurs in the forest by the Ngorongoro, and this corridor as well, the wildlife corridor from the crater down to Lake Manyara, which actually we've seen now a big increase with elephants habituating the corridor. As a result of conflict reducing, elephants are now more comfortable to stay in the corridor. But people need firewood, they need to heat their homes, they need to be able to cook off hot stoves, and this all is dependent therefore on trees. And so women in the communities are often those that will go in and are responsible for collecting firewood. And they're having to depend on not just dead wood on the ground, but also cutting trees, because there simply isn't enough to go around. So to combat that, we're establishing alternative fuel source in biofuel. which actually uses cow manure and discarded vegetable products that go into a biodigester, and this can be at someone's home and just buried underneath if they've got a small garden or plot next door. And then the methane that's captured from that manure is tapped with a pipe through to the home, and that can help with cooking, with providing light and power and heating sources. And then also the excess manure at the end is used to help fertilize the garden, which feeds into the permaculture side of things. So that will be our next educational programming that we hope to establish this year. Obviously there'll be some delays because of the pandemic. But yeah, community training really is at the heart of what we do, and it's the education, but it's also learning from local people and amplifying the knowledge and skills and expertise that already exists.
Yeah, great, thanks Francesca. I think really interesting as well to hear that it is a two-way street as well. As you said, it's too easy to think, oh yeah, we'll just go in, we'll run education programs, whereas actually that listen phase is so important to learn so much from local people who generally have a much better understanding than anyone coming in from the outside can. So that was really good. Irene, if you can share a bit about the education work you do.
Thank you. To echo what Francesca said about education, when we initially set up the Mara Predator Conservation Program in 2013, one of the first things that we did was reach out to the community, and this was done in a couple of ways. The first one was shooting a film about communities' views on predators. So we have a film in the Ma language, it's translated into English, and it's called Because of the Predators. And this is basically a series of interviews, with different community members on how they perceive predators and wildlife. Do they see direct benefits, and what would they like to see happening, and why don't they like predators in some cases? So obviously not everyone, was seeing the benefits, with coexisting with wildlife. And then to follow that up, we had a big questionnaire survey and targeted 800 homesteads across the Mara, again, talking about, conflict and what animals are seen as being problematic. But more importantly, it was what are some of the solutions that the community felt need to be put in place in order to mitigate this conflict. And using these two avenues, then we were able to, design a community program and interventions that are actually accepted and put forward by the community. So having barazas, which are local meetings with, community groups, and talking about what has been done, what's working and what's not working, how to improve certain strategies, has really helped us. And as I've mentioned, engaging the local youth group, who then, develop sketches and poems and go to the marketplace. And it's very interactive, and people are able to listen to these messages. And so we've just carried out an evaluation of, all these programs that we've been doing on the community side, and just seeing what needs improving. And something that's been clear is, the communities really like having these predator-proof bombers, and we've gotten quite a bit of funding from WWF, Nature Kenya, as well as AWF, to put this across the ecosystem. So a new thing we're looking at is trying to get the community to also contribute to the cost of the fencing, now that they've been able to see a positive impact of, actually securing the livestock. And so, that's something, just to make sure that there's that ownership. And then more on education is, as I'd mentioned, having wildlife clubs within schools, just to make sure that the younger generation are very aware of the resource that they have. Because in Kenya, wildlife belongs to the people, but unfortunately for a lot of local people, wildlife is seen as something for tourists, and they never get a chance to go into the National Reserve for a game drive. So under our wildlife clubs, we have an outreach officer who's working with 9 schools at the moment. And he goes to the schools, and there are activities. We have art competitions. we have kids camps during the holidays so that the children are able to talk to people who actually work within the wildlife sector, and also for them to appreciate that you can actually make a living from wildlife. Take them out for game drives, show them films, so things like, Living Planet, which would not be accessible to them, but these are documentaries that are actually shot in their backyard. So making sure that they see and appreciate what, millions of people come to Kenya and Africa to see. And last year we had support from, one of our donors, and we were able to take some children for the very first time. They left the Mara to go to Lewa to see wildlife in other parts of Kenya, and it was, very eye-opening for them. And we are hoping to be able to have this in future as well. And then with one of our other partners, Asilia Africa, they ran a kids camp called Twende Porini, where they shut down one of their camps for a week, and school children go and are sort of tourists in the camps. So they're able to get that tourist experience, stay in a 5-star lodge, talk to the people who work there, who most of the times are their family members, and also get researchers and people working in the community to go and talk to them. And unfortunately, we've had to, stop all our activities that involve large gatherings and the wildlife clubs because schools are now closed. But one thing we are working on right now is find how do we engage the children, because schools have been closed for 4 months in Kenya. How do we engage the children to make sure that they're still, building that interest in wildlife, especially now when wildlife is seen as a liability rather than, income is not being generated. So we are working on publishing short workbooks for them and, distributing them, having our outreach officer distribute to the areas where he can reach. And in these books, we'll have, short stories about wildlife, stories that are told in the Ma community about wildlife, but at the same time have a message about COVID and hand washing in a language that young people are able to understand, because we've noticed a lot of the messaging is very targeted at older audiences, and the children may be a bit left out. So that's something we are looking at doing, and also trying to get onto the local radio stations to talk about wildlife, and again talk about the pandemic and what it means for wildlife, and maybe even the link between wildlife and COVID, and just make sure that is understood in in a local context. Yeah, so those are some of the education programs we're trying, we've been running, and right now we are looking to modify them so that we are still interacting with the community as much as possible.
Okay, great, thanks Irene. Actually really interesting to hear then as well. It's both getting people to see the value of wildlife, but then also those health messages you can get through, right? That conservation doesn't just have to be about animals. Actually, you've got a really good opportunity to reach out to people that maybe aren't being spoken to by these wider projects. That sort of wider impact that conservation can have is brilliant. So thanks very much for that. I want to move on to now looking at rangers. So there's often a lot of people I talk to, particularly outside conservation, they think rangers equals conservation, and basically you employ rangers, and that's what conservation is. And we've heard this morning actually community conservation is key, but rangers are still an important part of that, either through the communication you can have with them when there is an issue with a predator, or just their wider engagement and monitoring of wildlife and stopping poaching. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit about the work you do with rangers, potentially how that engages with community as well, but why they're so valuable.
Yes, so rangers are boots on the ground. They are every day carrying out patrols, and they are the first responders. So as our Mara Predator Conservation Program, we don't have rangers as such, but we complement the work that the rangers carry out inside the conservancies as well as the National Reserve. So working with the lion ambassadors, we have a very strong presence in the community area. So these are areas that are not under protection. So they're not conservancies and then not the national reserve. And as we know, wildlife moves both in and out. And so having this really close relationship with the communities and having developed this network and built trust over, the past 7 years, we always get calls about, incidents outside conservancies and the National Reserve. So we're able to bring in the rangers and bring in, both conservancy rangers and county rangers, as well as the KWS rangers. And in cases where, we need the vet to come out, like the snared lion incident, we're able to then pass on this message to the KWS vet service and unit, and they're able to come out and carry out the treatment. So for us, we see that we are this really important link between communities and law enforcement, because sometimes as well, the communities are not very, comfortable directly going to the wildlife rangers. So that's how, as KWT, we support them. And at the moment, we have 10 of the lion ambassadors spread out across the Mara. That just reinforces what we've been doing even more, because we're able to get reports, from all corners of the ecosystem.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Irene. And good to see as well how it interacts with the work you're doing as well, and you can build that sort of trust as well, which is really good. Francesca, if you could speak a bit about the work you do with rangers as well.
Yes, great. We don't have any specific ranger programs within Wild Survivors, but we do partner with PAMS Foundation. So we partner with them in the Karatu districts, where our project site is, with the beehive fences close to Ngorongoro Crater. PAMS Foundation have got a fantastic history with anti-poaching. They've got intelligence-led anti-poaching programs that have really had incredible results in Tanzania, recovering huge numbers of elephants after the last poaching epidemic, and also making big changes in policy and the way that law enforcement is within Tanzania. So what we're able to do on the ground is by focusing on the human elephant mitigation side of things, we're able to, I guess, put a stop to where communities can see no other option but to get involved in poaching. And also by preventing the conflict itself, we can ensure that poaching gangs can't come in and intimidate local people into signing up and joining them. So touching upon a little bit of what Irene mentioned with community members and working with local people to ensure that there isn't there isn't a direct route into being sort of conflicted with poaching gangs. And also, in fact, the bee guardianship programs that we have at the moment, where we have members from the community who are there to maintain and manage the beehive fence, that also provides a bit of a stepping stone to future employment within wildlife areas. And that's similar to the program that our partners PAMS have with their elephant guardians. Again, it's a fantastic foundation to building up more education and expertise and skills in patrols. So they patrol the area, they patrol the corridor, they patrol the forests, and they're there within the community to be a direct point of contact if there were any concerns about unusual activity in the village, also bushmeat poaching, as well as obviously elephant poaching and other wildlife as well. So it's really important actually to put community members first in those opportunities, and that does start from a school, from schools up. And having those wildlife programs in schools is absolutely critical to basically demonstrating the opportunities that do exist within wildlife and conservation. We also work really closely with the head of elephant monitoring at the NCAA, which is the Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority. Bit of a mouthful, so hence the acronym. And they are a fantastic team of wildlife officers, and they have rangers that are constantly on patrol within the crater and the surrounding conservation area. And again, we work with the head of elephant monitoring in understanding elephant movements, any potential poaching threats, and making sure that the community are well supported, so that they also aren't seeing the threats from poachers that can come in. Obviously at the moment that's really heightened because of tourism being completely shut down, and I know we'll be touching upon that point later, and the impact that it has on funding for conservation and things like ranger patrols with those boots on the ground.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. Really interesting to hear more about that. And again, I think the interesting interplay between, again, the community work and the rangers, that it's not, you know, a one or the other. Actually, the better they're viewed and the better integrated they are. That's really positive. Stu, and actually, did you have anything you wanted to talk about as we're about halfway through, just on the sort of wider CCG Trust perspective?
Sure, thanks, Richard. Yeah, I just want to make a couple of points. On the Rangers point, of course, the Rangers' primary responsibility is operating within the parks. I think one of the key strengths and important roles of these sorts of independent projects that we're hearing from today is the work they do in the buffer zones and management areas around the parks, where ranger patrols are not as active as they are within the parks. So I think that's why part of the work that Francesca and Irene are doing in their projects is so vitally important. And then secondly, on the earlier questions about community engagement and education, it just reminded me of a great quote by the late, great Nelson Mandela, I think it was, who said, ultimately, conservation is about people. And I think hearing about Kenya Wildlife Trust and Wild Survivors work really illustrates that very, very strong point. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thanks, June. Really good points, and yeah, that quote as well. I think I certainly know when I started in this sector about 10 years ago, I thought it would all just be spending time with animals, and then actually when I got out on the field and started doing work, I was like, oh, actually, yeah, it's literally spending time with people. I didn't get anywhere near any animals for quite a long time. So actually, yeah, that's a really important point to make, and that so much work does engage with people. So then the fourth question I wanted to go on to, I know you've already sort of talked about it, but just go into a bit more detail about how important protecting and restoring habitat is. So making sure that animals actually have that space to roam freely, and then also just ensuring that animals, or wild animals particularly, stay healthy as well, whether that's through vet interventions or, again, stopping poisonings and so on. So I think, Francesca, if you could kick us off with that.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, it's absolutely critically important to the survival of endemic species, to biodiversity and the health of the planet. And biodiversity, of course, provides essential functions that we all benefit from, that we all need to survive. So protecting those and restoring those essential habitat ranges and protected areas is crucial to the survival for local people and for wildlife. So it's all very much interlinked. Of course, trees, the soil, they all capture carbon, and they all perform other really essential functions for the planet to keep running. So absolutely, we touched upon earlier, fragmenting habitat, it means actually whole ecosystems can be lost as a result, even micro ecosystems, and a whole chain effect as a result of that. So it's really important to create a balance. We need habitat to support species, to support the environment, but it also needs to benefit communities. And that comes in terms of diversifying of income and livelihoods, and looking at other environmentally friendly livelihoods, such as ones we've touched upon: beekeeping, permaculture, alternative fuel sources, just really valuing the environment around villages and around areas. And I think in terms of education as well, running workshops in environmental health, learning a bit more about those processes that we don't necessarily see in front of us, but are all existing behind the scenes. And I think people that live alongside these protected areas, learning about those critical functions that the trees play and the part they play in the health of the environment, how that impacts the climate and everything, which again has an impact on their future yields of crops and livelihoods in agriculture. So it really is all interlinked. And having the guardianship roles that we touched upon as well, and local beekeeping trainers and practitioners in permaculture, educational officers as well, and those that Irene mentioned, it all feeds into the educational piece, and the importance of protecting habitats. Even more so touching upon the wildlife corridor that we spoke about earlier, there used to be about 9 of these wildlife corridors in northern Tanzania, probably about 2 decades ago now. Today, there's barely 3. And these are essential for migratory species such as elephants to actually migrate across vast areas. They need for foraging, they need for water sources, and also to create a diverse gene pool. In the crater itself, it's home to about 1,000 elephants. They're some of the biggest elephants in Tanzania because they do have, they're quite unique with the fact they've got this abundance of foraging within the crater and the larger conservation area. But they have to migrate, they have to diversify their gene pool. And further encroachment and deforestation, which is another big problem in Tanzania, has a huge impact on cutting up those corridors and fragmenting that land. And making it much more difficult for elephants to migrate. And also, of course, it increases conflicts and it also undermines other livelihoods as a result. So yes, protecting habitat and restoring places that have been lost, that we need to bring back, is a core function of our work, and it is critically important to conservation.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. I think a really good point there as well. It's both habitat, but also that wider gene pool to enable that movement and then potentially to reduce conflict as well. Mm-hmm. That it's not just purely about giving animals space to roam, it's also to then really spread out and get the strongest genes moving around. So thanks for that. And Irene, if you could talk a bit about your work in that area.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And, Francesca has summed it up beautifully, taking this ecosystem approach and ensuring that, the landscape as a whole is maintained and conserved and can retain as much integrity as possible is critical in the work we do. So making sure we have intact habitats and ecological communities as well as the ecosystem functions is really, really critical. And Stuart talked about the buffers and making sure that the buffers are protected as well is something we look at. A lot of times when you read papers and publications about wildlife and threats facing wildlife, one key thing that stands out is loss of habitat and connectivity loss. And what we try to do is ensure that we maintain this landscape connectivity, but we're not just looking at it from the scientific side as well. For both our projects, we have people at the center of everything we do. So how do we ensure that the culture is also maintained and we conserve the indigenous, ways of doing things, while at the same time making sure that the landscapes are healthy, not just for wildlife, but for the communities who live there and their livestock, and then the wildlife. So in our case, the question would be, but KWT is a predator trust, so why are we taking this ecosystem approach? But we believe that if the people are not getting, what they need for their livelihoods and their livestock are not able to thrive and be healthy, then wildlife is directly affected. If the grasses are not maintained and, the habitat is not pristine, then there's no prey base upon which predators then survive. So for me, it's sort of a full circle with people, family at the center, and also looking at programs and projects that talk to increasing vulnerability to climate change and making these ecosystems and the people more resilient to these disturbances and changes that are being seen more and more as the years go by. But I think critically, as Francesca mentioned, is, are the communities having their livelihood needs met? Are they benefiting directly from these ecosystems that we're trying to protect? So for us, the people, predators, and partnership then fit in really well with this ecosystem approach, where we're looking at everything from, the carbon in the soil to the grass, to the trees and the rivers, and then making sure we also tap into traditional knowledge, which is how these ecosystems survived for hundreds of years before, us as modern conservationists, we went there and just making sure that we have a package that is holistic. So for me, it's really important to take that approach and make sure that we look at it from the top and not just concentrate on certain aspects of of science and nature, but bring it all together to have this one package that works for people, their livestock, and the wildlife.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. Again, a really interesting point bringing in that it's not, the habitat isn't just about wildlife, it's actually, again, about people and climate change and all those issues really, and how fundamentally interrelated they are. It's really useful and important thing to remember. So coming to the last two questions now, we've already sort of touched on it a little bit, but I think a lot of people will be interested. There's been a lot in the media as well about the impact of COVID on tourism and on donations generally. So maybe if you could talk a bit about what the impact COVID has had, and then also more widely then how important are donations, tourism, or any other source of funding to the work that you do?
Okay, thank you, Richard. As I mentioned earlier, Kenya Wildlife Trust was set up by the safari industry. So our foundations, are very strongly rooted in tourism. And we have, quite a number of strategic partners who are within the tourism industry. And over the past 1 year, we've been forming more and more partnerships with people along the whole value chain of tourism. So we get quite a lot of support from the safari companies through, donations of bed nights, be it, $5 donated to us for every bed night, or in some cases we get $8 from Karen Downey Safaris who set KWT up. And unfortunately, this has had to stop. So we still have the support and goodwill from the tourism industry. It's just not translating into dollars because they also do not have those dollars. But we've been talking to them about how to carry on our operations through this time, and a lot of them are spending time talking to their clients, and some companies are pre-selling safaris, and to ensure that some of the donations that go to conservation are still being put in place. But I think, to answer your question, definitely we are feeling the pinch as a result of COVID in terms of, drastically reduced donations. So we are having to look at, our donor base as well. It's sort of forcing not just us as conservationists, but I think the whole industry to look at how to diversify how we look at funding.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. Interesting to know, and also good to hear that some of those travel companies have been looking to pre-sell, so at least to try and get some of that revenue coming in. But yeah, how the future of conservation will diversify, I think will be an interesting one. We'll come back to that next. But Francesca, if you could talk a bit as well about COVID's impact and on donations and tourism.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, of course, the impact of COVID has been immense. It's transcended everywhere. I think it's affected everywhere across Africa, national parks, protected areas, and in Tanzania, they're absolutely desperate for tourists to return. Obviously, since things shut down in March, it's completely ground to a halt. And as a result, the country, I think, normally would earn about 18% of its GDP from tourism. And 80-90% of what some of the protected areas that we work alongside require funding-wise comes from tourism. So it's already having really far-reaching effects to that degree. The Ngorongoro crater, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thousands and thousands of tourists normally come and visit every year, and I think they are also 80% funded by tourism. So budgets are running out, it's running low, and as a result, also we've seen informants who are vital, they're critical, they're community informants on the ground that obviously the identities are protected. They haven't been able to be paid, so they're no longer helping to inform a range of patrols and wildlife officers. And of course, there's only splinter teams now operating on the ground, running rounds, and trying to reach as many areas as possible in the 4x4s, to try and get on top of some of the new poaching camps that have been established in some of these really dense parts of the forest that are often inaccessible by vehicle as well. So it's unfortunately, we have seen a spike in poaching in the area, which is obviously really upsetting, and there haven't been any cases for, I think, about 18 months to 2 years in this particular area before that. So it is concerning. We have been trying to look again at building almost a rapid response fund, pulling together our donors. We also try to diversify our funding and look more at sort of social impact investors and individuals who may not have been affected as much by COVID, or are able to help inject some cash much faster than, say, some of the foundations that, of course, are affected because their donor pools equally have had their income streams affected from lack of work in all parts of the world. So yeah, it has had a dramatic impact on things. Tanzania, I know that they've opened up their borders. They really want to see tourists coming back in, and that's got to be done safely. Another project site that we're working with is part of what's called a wildlife management area, and these areas are established with a number of villages who donate land into an area that then is protected, that doesn't get cultivated. It's still village land, but it's there for the purpose of to be completely rewilded, if you like, if it's not wild already. And it's an area where safari lodges can build the new campsites, new lodges on outside of national parks, and which can be more affordable for them as a company, but also you can get a much more wild experience because you don't have as many vehicles driving around. It's very exclusive areas of land. But the benefit to those communities, and the reason that they donate this land and set up these wildlife management areas, is that there's normally a percentage from every single tourist that stays at those safari lodges that goes back to the communities, and that's over the years formed quite a crucial part of their annual budgets and expenditures that they need to develop healthcare, develop education, to use as emergency funding pools as well for things that are needed within the village. So that alone is going to have quite a far-reaching impact on the communities that are part of these WMAs. And that's where really we've got to pull together organisations, funding pools, whatever we can to help support the ranger patrols and also the communities on the front line of things as well. And hopefully, you know, we can start to see or make sense of where this pandemic's going, and get a better understanding of how it's going to impact on the subtropical countries as well, whose numbers may have not spiked as fast as we've seen in the Northern Hemisphere. And yes, it's going to be a case of monitoring that really closely and making sure that we can establish some tours and to bring tourists back in a safe way to bring them confidence as well, and an opportunity to help support these incredible countries, these species-rich landscapes that tourists that we all love to see and be a part of. And really, it's a time now for a global effort to make sure that they're protected into the future.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. And interesting to see there's already a bit of innovation coming in there, and similarly, like Irene said, actually at least trying to pre-sell tours that companies and organisations, I think, now are starting to see that need for innovation and diversification. So, which nicely leads on to the final question. Actually, I'll bring Katie and Stuart in as well for this one. I think it'd be interesting to see that bigger sort of CCG picture, but start with Francesca. So, what do you think the biggest positive innovation for conservation either will be or could be within, say, the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's a great question, Richard. I really enjoyed having a good think about this. Yeah, I think it's going to be largely linked to technology. Technology is, of course, advancing faster than any of us can keep up with. But technology for conservation can have so many interesting, diverse benefits, not just app creation, alerts for communities, learning portals, but really I think it can feed into a bigger global network that we need to create in conservation, which can bring in a collection of funders, whether it's Fortune 500 companies, dynamic funders, of course our foundations and grant makers as well, but also to galvanize that support in fundraising, impact monitoring, collaboration, to lobby governments to help with policy, and to put communities first when it comes to protecting biodiversity. And I think that can all come together under a bigger head of technology, and to link those key funding areas, and to create networks and coalitions for more organizations to share ideas, share experiences, data, and so that we can all learn and make it more streamlined. I think it really needs to evolve and become a much more efficient process when it comes to funding, and that being injected into the right places in conservation. And yeah, I think some sort of technology, maybe it's something we can work on behind the scenes, but something to do with, you know, an elephant think tank, which can be linked into a technology portal, or something that everyone can connect with.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. And interesting, that use of technology, I think, particularly to sort of bring people together more and make sure when the lessons learned in one area, it then quickly goes to the other locations. I mean, it's interesting. I've heard about the elephant fences a few years back, about 7 years ago, I think now, and everywhere I've gone, I've just told people about them. And it's interesting now that message is starting to get through, and you're hearing, I had a random conversation with somebody yesterday, a friend of a friend, who heard I worked in conservation, said, oh, have you heard of the beehive fences? But that's taken 7 to 10 years to come through. So yeah, absolutely. If we can get something quicker that can really share those learnings, I think that'd be really useful. And then, yeah, same question to Irene.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, you know, what this pandemic has, in a way, forced people to do, sort of thinking outside the box and, you know, tapping into existing resources, so looking at technology. But I think for me, I would flip it a bit, because one thing that's come out very clearly is the reliance on tourism by conservation to, you know, to survive. So for me, it would be, what would be the innovative ideas on how to raise funding for conservation without relying on tourism, and how do we support the communities who are, you know, overly reliant on tourism? Because one of the things we are seeing now is, you know, total loss of household income in some areas. You know, when you look at the Mara, a lot of the people are employed both directly and indirectly by tourism. A lot of income to households come from, you know, tourism through lease fees, these jobs that are given, the beadwork enterprises that are there, and even, you know, the small honey enterprises that are there rely on selling these products to tourism. So how do we provide, you know, opportunities for, you know, beehive fences to sell their products beyond the wildlife area? And again, technology, you know, comes in. But then also, what other income streams are there for communities, so that tourism is not seen as the main livelihood stream, but as a secondary one? Because, you know, the pandemic is one thing, but there'll be other things that keep knocking down tourism. So for me, it's sort of trying to encourage us to think outside the box. And I think in this way, it will also encourage people to invest in conservation if, you know, we come up with ideas that are diverse and sustainable. So how do we get corporates, for instance, to support conservation? And, you know, when we talk about conservation, as we've said throughout the call, it's not just wildlife, it's community. How do we get them to support community conservation? And more importantly, at least in Kenya, because this is a national priority, how do we ensure that there's food security in these areas? How do we work with the communities and the conservation sector to just bring everything together to tick all those boxes of conservation and food security, because they are, you know, directly linked to each other. If there's no income from tourism, then, you know, people don't have money for basic things, including food. So I think for me, it's a lot of thinking, and, you know, new thinking needs to be done by conservation as a whole and coming up with really interesting ways to widen, the donor base for conservation, to bring in government. And as Francesca said, how do we ensure that there are policies in place, the right policies to motivate people as well, to donate and support, conservation work. So for me, I'm hoping that, it won't take 10 years, but, sooner rather than later, that we can start coming up with more and more innovative ways and ideas and, set the ball rolling with this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. Really interesting to look at. Actually, that's part of our sort of mission as a company with Tunza Games, was just to try and show another way to raise funds. So, everyone at Christmas buys a board game. Actually, if we can convert some of that spend into supporting conservation work, that sort of shows the way, if we can get more and more products that people can buy that help protect wildlife, that can actually help diversify that income. And even better, if those products, like the honey, for example, are made on the ground by local communities, then the benefit of those sorts of processes can be huge. That's something I looked at a lot in my PhD research as well, as new ways to monetize conservation for exactly those reasons, that there's so much reliance on tourism, actually. If we can move beyond that, it'd be a really, really big benefit for the sector. So thanks very much for that. And then, Katie and Stuart, give you a chance to come in on that. So I guess from the wider CCG Trust, we heard at the start, you support a lot of entrepreneurial approaches to conservation. So what do you see from CCG Trust's perspective as probably being the big innovations in the next decade?
Our speakers have spoken very well about the subject. A couple of examples come to mind from me. I heard on a recent webinar in conservation the concept of the sofa safari, which I guess is an example of a technology-enabled new way of reaching out to the wider world. But of course, it's not just about the technology. The innovation has to come in the marketing, the PR, and the promotion as well. People forget that technology is only part of a solution. That's one thought. And perhaps, in fact, Tunza Games could look into that and gamify the whole concept of digital safaris with that sort of idea. And then the other thought I had was is linked to a point that Irene made, actually, is innovation in finance. In fact, I'm involved in another project looking at the whole area. A number of key players are now starting to think about how to bring in a wider source of funding for conservation and different types of funding. And I think this is really just the beginning of that process. So over the next few years, I think we'll see a lot of initiatives and new products coming to market to try and close that funding gap, which is very significant. Thank you. Katie, anything to add to that from our experience of our portfolio?
No, I think most of it's been covered. To be honest, like you said, I think it's the shift in funding, because what this current situation has highlighted is that sort of everyone's been affected by the pandemic, and everyone's income streams have been hit, and it's sort of a time when conservation is needed the most. There's the most sort of limited funding available, so it would be great in the future to sort of see a bit of a system change in a way to maybe more impact type investing or something like that, just to ensure that it's sustainable.
Great. Thanks, Katie and Stuart. So yeah, I mean, interesting to sort of see those different viewpoints on what the future will be as well. So yeah, just to sum up, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you for coming on today. It's been really interesting to hear both the wider CCG picture and then also actually those specific experiences and work that you're doing on the ground. And then also just sort of going through some elements within the game as well. It's good to hear that that is actually, reflective of what's going on in the field, which is really useful. So yeah, final big thanks to Francesca, Irene, Katie and Stuart